Sure. And to be honest, like I think testing is the only constant, right, in in a marketer's life. So you're pretty much always testing. And to be honest, I think one challenge why a lot of organizations or marketing teams are not able to build this as a practice is, I think, because they look at it as a siloed effort, right? I think fundamentally, and I was fortunate to see it at Uber, right, is even testing in marketing was not a function of just marketing sitting and brainstorming and figuring out, okay, these are the tests we need to run, right? You essentially ran like a pod wherein you had buy-in from the product, somebody on the product side, right? Somebody on the UI UX team as well, right? And then you don't start with saying, hey, we need to test these 5 things. You always start to say, okay, here is the metric we're trying to move, right? So like you almost have a process saying, hey, here is the metric, right? Let's say you could say, hey, our install to sign up is actually pretty bad, right? That's where you start with, and then you start hypothesizing, saying, here are 5 hypotheses or on why it is bad and what could be changed, right? So instead of saying, let's run a bunch of tests and change creative and change this button, you start with a hypothesis and then you start building your test scenarios, right? The second thing we did, and a lot of especially happens in early stage, is you'll build a lot of hypotheses and saying, hey, we should test this. What you end up realizing is, okay, you know what, we don't have engineering bandwidth, right? So what you end up doing is just doing sort of these button tests, right? Change from green to red, right? The reality is in early, like it's also a life stage issue, right? If you're an early stage business, if you want to test anything, it's very unlikely you will get statistical significance results, right? So instead of doing very little changes, like changing the red button from green button or changing, sort of making very small changes, you have to swing for the fences, right? Like a completely different approach, right? Positioning A versus positioning B, right? Test those, right? And as you sort of grow in scale is when the incremental testing practices need to be built, right? Which is saying, do I add more friction in the form? Do I remove this particular field? Do I add this field, right? Because as you get larger, you'll get results much faster, versus when you're a smaller business and you're just starting out, right? You can spend days building these small tests and not get to any significant conclusion, right? So that's, I think, the first, which is saying testing A cannot be a isolated siloed marketing function, right? Because the reality is, yes, marketing looks at it, but like a lot of times it could just be a product, right? It could just be saying how your onboarding flows work. So you can tweak messaging all day long, you can change colors all day long, but like none of that is going to change the needle for you, right? So I think for me, having seen it at a bunch of places, one, it is, testing is more a mindset before it becomes like a, which tool do we use and what do I test, right? And then ideally you have more stakeholders buying in, right? And the last piece is also being able to structure sort of a philosophy around testing, right? Which is like, we do it based on like a effort to reward ratio, right? So I mean, at any point of time, you have like 15 hypotheses and 15 tests you could run, right? The reality of it is, how do you prioritize what matters and what you can put through, right? So what we build a little bit of a framework is called a effort to reward, right? So if it's about changing the entire sort of onboarding flow as to how somebody engages with the product, right? That probably is high reward, right? But it's also high effort because you need to get on the engineering sprint, right? So we sort of structure it based on how engineering builds sprints and say, okay, you know what, we at any point of time, we should have low effort, medium reward tests going on. And then based on engineering bandwidth, slot a few of these high effort, potentially high reward tests as well, right? And which is what I have seen as testing from a marketeers, especially in the tech industry. I think it works really well if you've aligned it with the product org versus just trying to run it on your own end, right? Like, so I think that's sort of my philosophy in terms of process and a practice is, A, you need to, again, start with the business problem and not just saying we need to run 10-15 tests this quarter. And then get more buy-in, right? Because when you have more stakeholders involved, I think you get richer insights, you get richer hypotheses, and you get better buy-in to actually be able to find bandwidth and run those tests.
Got it, Ankit. Just one curious question, and I'm again coming from experiences that we all have had. A common problem that I've noticed with testing is that you got a particular team who's been running tests, who has got certain hypothesis proven or failed. Okay. Now, this person probably leaves after 2 years with that organization. history you'll find after 2 years, a new team probably doing the same test again and not counting on the data on the history which was earlier there.
Right. So I think two pieces for me, right? And to be honest, you're right. It's very difficult, right? I think documentation or like building a knowledge repository is very, very hard, especially in early stage, right? Because everybody has too much to do. So who bothers about documentation? But I think two things that I've seen help when it is done right is I think most product analytics or marketing analytics tools today come with a feature of annotations, right? So one of the things I think we saw which started giving us like better knowledge management is just making annotations in the product or marketing analytics tools itself, right? Wherein we would say, hey, at this date on my sign up to deposit funnel, we launched this test one, right? And just capture like a little snippet of saying what the test was, right? And the other thing, I think what I learned in big organizations like Uber and Amazon is this whole culture of something called RFC or request for campaign, right? So everything that was tested was essentially first built into like a simple document which says, here is what we are trying to do. This is why we are doing it. And here are all the teams or all the functions that get impacted, right? So you essentially had to get a sign off saying, hey, we are okay if you're doing the test. Because like, for example, you could run a test in marketing, but that could totally sort of impact how ops is done, right? Or how customer support is done, right? And which is where as the org grows, I think we mandated a process of RFC, which was done for every team, right? Product team changes a feature, they have to send an RFC to marketing. Marketing does like a big test, they have to send an RFC to the right product stakeholder, right? So while documentation is always an issue, I think what we learned is if there is a consistent sort of documentation approach across different teams, I think that's the best way to preserve knowledge and be able to pass that on to teams that sort of come later and want to potentially run the same hypothesis or the test, right? But you're right. I don't think it's perfect yet. I think there's a lot of room to both in terms of what tools could do, but also what marketing teams as a process could put in.
Nikhil, I'd like to add something.
Sure.
Yeah, so to what Ankit said, actually testing is definitely a mindset, right? I think a month back, we were at this CRM retention summit by WebEngage, and someone from Airtel Data Labs was talking about, how testing is ingrained in their DNA, right? With a massive organization like Airtel, they have 5,000 ad groups running across various, channels in various languages, right? So how will you ensure that you're testing at scale and making, the most out of it? So they're relying on tools like RocketEMs of the world, where you do creative A/B testing and also get real-time insights, which are probably recorded, which solves the problem of the handshake breakage when a team changes, right? So of course, very well put, Ankit, that testing is a mindset. It is kind of the virasat which needs to be passed on to the newer teams whenever whenever there is a fallout in the existing teams, because testing if it's a mindset, it can be achieved at scale, right? You'll figure out ways to it. But then if you don't want to do it, then of course, God save you.
So I just wanted to add, Shitiz and Ankit, in fact, I was in a meeting before I came to this session, which is basically to do with some testing and some implementation happened, which basically reject all attribution numbers across my company. So I think while testing is important, one real world suggestion and example, keep documentation as your God and as your Bible. Because what you guys are talking about, some product team did some test and implemented it, and it just rejigged numbers. I mean, I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, I'm at a run rate of 50. A particular team is at a run rate of 50 acquisitions per day. I wake up today morning and they're at 15. And I had a mini heart attack. I was like, what the hell just happened? And a team which was clocking a run rate of 5 was suddenly at 72. So while testing is good and it's great and it has to be implemented, documentation is the Bible, because that's the problem we face. The documentation wasn't there, the teams were not aware. And I think collectively as a company, we had a heart attack in the morning. So just wanted to add that documentation is key.
Absolutely. It's basically, testing also tests you in a way.
Absolutely.